Welcome to Wired to Lead, the podcast where neuroscience meets leadership. Hi, I'm Julia LeFevre, and each week we're going to explore how our brains impact our behavior and how we can rewire our brains so that we can lead with clarity, confidence, and impact. Are you ready? Let's dive in. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Wired to Lead. I am so excited that today we have Teresa Turner on the show with us. Teresa is the president of Synchronized Resources, and she has a long and fruitful career in affirmative action, equal opportunity, and she has assisted so many well-known Fortune 500 companies in integrating these policies into their everyday in a way that aligns with their values. So, Teresa, it's so good to have you. Welcome.
Thank you so very much, Julia, for the invitation. I'm really excited for the topic, obviously, and I look forward to answering any questions and having a great dialogue on what I'm sure is still a pretty topical and relevant subject matter. And I hope what we can do today is kind of level set and kind of debunk, some of the myths that are associated with affirmative action. And quite frankly, the same baggage in some respects has spilled over to efforts under DEI.
Absolutely. Well, before we get too far ahead of ourselves, I want our listeners to get to know a little bit more about you. And so tell us about the leadership journey of Teresa Turner.
Well, I will kind of try to keep this to a 2-3 minute elevator speech. And basically, I took to the field of equal opportunity quite naturally. I was completing my associate degree. I knew I wanted to get into human resources. I didn't quite know what avenue to pursue to do that. But I did know that I wanted to continue my education and that it would require a sponsor, if you will, an organization that had tuition reimbursement and the kind of tools that, folks entering the workforce are looking for, especially when you go into it knowing that you want a career in something. And that's going to
Absolutely.
require, a dedication along the education line. So after my associate degree, I took a couple of roles in temporary positions. And I ended up using that subject matter, contract and temporary employment, throughout my educational journey, because back in the day, without dating myself too much, that was a very popular topic. Third-party employment, how contract employment was being used. And I was fortunate enough as a temporary, working for Monsanto Corporation at the time, to go overseas with the database that I had created to help train the overseas staff on the use of that field trial database. When I got back, I wanted to get more into HR, and I approached the temporary service about a role as a sales rep working with corporations to staff their temporary needs. And unfortunately, it's in that position that I ran smack dab into the face of what discrimination looks like. And that was when I couldn't understand why we were having a difficult time filling clerical positions. So I asked the recruiters, could you meet with me after hours? I'll order a pizza, take me through how you're pulling out candidates for the jobs I'm bringing forth with some of these major companies. And very quickly, I noted that all the ones they were sliding over and explaining to me why they would reject them, they all had a code NFO at the top. And I finally sat back and I said, wait a minute, I'm confused. These all have the same code. What does NFO mean? And the response set me back. It meant not front office. So what that means, when I dug deeper, every application that was marked not front office was a minority candidate.
Wow.
So I resigned my position, went to another temporary service down the road who put me, and I'm not making this up, in a 6-month temporary assignment in another corporation here in St. Louis in the Equal Opportunity Affairs Department. And that was my first introduction that companies actually had a function designed, and not only designed, but embedded in civil rights regulations designed to prohibit that kind of activity. So that was probably a little more than 3 minutes, but that is truly how my eyes opened up to this thing called compliance. That's another thing
Mhm.
that's always kind of confused me a little bit. It's not really, in some companies, it's not viewed as an HR function. Some folks view it strictly as compliance as in you're aligned with any other kind of auditing group, that's looking for legal thresholds to be met and somebody to be able to raise a flag if and when that area shows risk.
Wow.
So, fast forward 30 some odd years, I've been in the field for quite some time, have managed Synchronized Resources as an independent consulting firm for 26 years.
Mm.
And I never did think, though, that I would enter the field at a time when, the ADA was coming into place. So many great things were happening. And it looks like, at the latter part of my career, we're going to be revisiting, what are we doing here? How far back, are we going to roll some of these, regulations that were really put in place to protect everybody?
Right. It's so interesting to me that your entry into this whole field started with you experiencing the consequences of not having an equal opportunity program. You were feeling the pinch. Why are we not finding people to hire? And then what I love is that you got curious and you started digging. And I just want to celebrate that because so many leaders, I think that's, we hear all the time that we've got to be curious. And this is just a great example of why, to get to the root of the problem.
Well, and that's what, when I stepped into the role at, this major corporation in their Equal Opportunity Affairs Department, um, the very practice of going through a compliance review,
Mm.
and a deep dive on a company's employment records. Trust me, I know it's not something, companies sit back and applaud and necessarily welcome, but it does serve a purpose. And there are, I could go on and repeat the people across the board that have been impacted by, quite frankly, company policies that themselves aren't enforced. So sometimes I'll look at organizations and say, folks, time out. When we talk about the risk that came to be in this situation, we violated our own policy. So
Is
it
there a sense
really
of
did.
surprise? Like, are they like, oh, or, what's the response then when they have someone like you able to kind of shine a light on that?
Well, I would say, fortunately for me, I've been very, 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 very lucky in that I can only think of a couple, and I work with a lot of companies. I can only think of a couple of companies that really viewed my role as get in, do the job, get this audit closed, and then see you later.
Mm.
My approach has always been a bit different. And I let them know out of the gate my role is to prepare you to go through this engagement in such a way that nothing is asked of us or flagged as a potential risk for us that I
Mm.
haven't already flagged in advance.
Mm.
And so my approach was to always let corporations know, obviously, the more buttoned up we are in our processes, the better off.
Mm,
Regardless, however, the more we look at this as an opportunity to learn and have our policies tested and somehow manage to keep it in that light, the better the audit engagement goes overall.
mm,
And I have never been disappointed, like I said, except for
mm,
a couple of times, and one was horrific. And
mm,
maybe later we can touch on a couple of, what made that so eye-opening.
yeah.
But generally, managers will listen when you're sitting and talking about a specific case. And when I say
Mm,
case, a specific situation,
right.
when you sit and say, Sam, this is an area the government's focused on right now. And we need to backtrack and understand how and why you made the decisions you made.
Mm,
And when we can get through that, and at the end of the day, even if we take what I call a slap on the hand, and that's generally where an audit closes and we just get a list of do betters.
yeah.
Do better at communicating more, do better at training more.
Mm,
But I seriously have never had an audit that has resulted in issues of back pay or anything of that nature. And once we've been through a compliance review, the organizations I worked with take it even more seriously because they
mm,
understand it's not I gotcha. It's how
yeah,
well are you abiding by your own policies a lot of the time.
absolutely. Well, I love how, in some ways, you're taking the uncertainty out of the equation. And we all know that uncertainty puts us all kind of on
Oh,
edge.
yeah,
And so I love that. And then you're inviting them, hey, let's learn and let's grow in this. Like, this isn't about punishing anyone or, any team. It's how can we actually do better at the ways that we're trying to collaborate.
exactly.
Yeah. So, okay, so you had these experiences that kind of led you into this. So, I'm just a little bit curious, going back a little bit further, I'm guessing that not all people in your situation would have gotten curious and would have asked those initial questions of why is this happening? And so I'm just curious, is there something in your past that cultivated kind of this natural curiosity and desire to make sure that things are happening the way they're supposed to?
Well, I will say there are a few circumstances in my family life, a younger brother with disabilities, and just getting through school uh, with the family. We moved a lot. So just differing rules and regulations and laws pertaining to, uh, the accessibility issues. And this was, back in the 70s, you know, so a lot of that didn't exist. And if it did, it was state to
Oh,
state. So and once you've been in a situation where you know what accessibility looks like, and then you go somewhere else. So transition that to race and gender issues.
mm,
Um, in my, first jobs, at 14, 15. Well, I will say my first job, I joke and say I was a paper boy. I had an interview one time for that temporary sales job. And the vice president of sales that kept pushing on me about what's your sales experience? Because keep in mind, I was a temp for them, right?
right.
And I did a great job. And so I thought, hey, that should be enough to get me a trial, as a sales rep. And he kept pushing on all his sales experience. And he finally gave me an opening. He stepped back and he said, I've been in sales so long, I started out as a sales boy. And I stepped back and I said, well, Mr. Bascom, we have that in common. And he said, what's that? And I said, I was a sales boy too. Yes, that was deliberate, but it took us off to the races.
Yeah.
Okay, so that was an example, and again, several of those, and I'm not going to belabor all those because
Yeah.
any young woman, going into certain industries, even the restaurant industry,
Mhm.
it can be problematic. We'll put it that way.
Right.
As far as the racial issues, keep in mind, I said I was a temporary, and one of the things I took note of, I would be a temp right next to a young lady that just came in 2 days ago who might be Hispanic or African American or
Okay.
Asian. And then I would come in a couple of days later and I would be like, what happened to Janice? Oh, the boss didn't like her, or she wasn't keeping busy. She was reading a book and not working. Well, she's reading a book because she didn't have anything to do.
Yeah.
So, in that situation, my awareness,
Yeah.
why is this happening? So, when I had the reins to question deeper, this ties into what I was seeing as a tip. Why
Yeah.
is that happening?
Mm.
And
I love
that's
it.
when I pushed, I saw, and then I ran the hell away from that opportunity. And they even asked me, do you want us to place you in another temporary? And I said, absolutely not. If I do that, I'm still condoning
Yeah.
your practices.
Yeah.
So no. And I went down the street to their competitor. And that's when I ended up in so to me, what was most, you know, kind of that aha moment, the
Mm.
timing of both of those.
Yeah. And that
And then
you
to
just
land in a
happen.
department,
Yes.
I'm serious. I was like, who knew that there were, companies and departments strictly focused on making sure things like that don't happen. And I still go back to, and it shouldn't happen for anybody.
Right.
So one of the myths is, I said, we'll break down a couple
Mm.
of
Yeah.
myths. One of the myths is that this framework doesn't work for males, and in particular, white males. And
Mm.
I can honestly say it does, and it has. And I think that's one of the things that, I think many of us in the field, if we had things to do over again, there would have been better communication around this thing called goals
Mm.
that
Yeah.
got conveyed or construed as being quotas. And
Mm.
honestly, except in what they call the very outlandish cases of companies just refusing to modify policies and procedures, very, very, very few cases of what you could call a court mandated quota because of major wrongdoing.
Right.
So, in that regard, I think that is a topic that has kind of spilled over a bit into the DEI space. And that's where the two, my mantra right now is, folks, let's not throw those metrics out with the tainted bathwater.
Mm.
Let's try to have deeper conversations on what the metrics meant, how to minimize some of the just total misnomers, the things that should not be associated with it, and then really look at the components that we can all agree have merit when we're
Right.
looking at merit-based opportunity hiring, which is what we're struggling with transitioning to. What were we doing under affirmative action that doesn't meet the standard under merit-based opportunity? And I'll be one to say not anything other than some companies misusing the information and the data in a way that would position it as being the norm. And that just isn't the case.
Yeah. So it's so interesting, this whole topic, and the thing that keeps coming to my mind is, you mentioned that kind of the myth is that white men will not benefit. They're going to lose. So it kind of has turned into a zero sum game of some people win and some people lose. So I'm
Mm-hmm.
just curious. I would love for you to talk a little bit more about that. How does it work for everyone? What are we, what does it working, what are we really aiming for in this whole, in all of these processes?
Okay, and again, trying to keep this simple.
Yeah.
Affirmative action came about, the view of affirmative action today under the Executive Order 11246, folks. That's the regulation that used to cover the affirmative action program for females and minorities.
Mm.
Of the 3 regulatory statutes for affirmative action, there's 2 others. One covers veterans, and the other covers individuals with disabilities. Both of those affirmative action programs are embedded in actual law. The
Okay.
executive order AAP, as the 2 first words indicate, came about as an executive order, just like the way it went out came about as an executive order. Affirmative action for females and minorities was never embedded in the regulations. Okay? It started off with, prior to the actual goal setting being incorporated, affirmative action started off with, we are going to make sure everybody knows that this company is an equal opportunity employer. We're going to start hanging out signs, equal opportunity employer. We're going to start putting taglines all over everything that references a job, job description, job ad, saying we're an equal opportunity employer. And guess what? That didn't change a lot. Folks think it was under the Kennedy administration or the Johnson administration when the goals and timetables came into play. It wasn't. It came into play under Nixon. And folks are sometimes surprised about that. There have been support for affirmative action under both administrations from the beginning. It goes back and forth and always has every election year, but never quite like it has this past election cycle. Right?
Right.
So the goals and timetables, again, the goal was, okay, we're going to put some, I call it teeth, into the regulations.
Yeah.
So we're going to make you look at your workforce. Where are you recruiting? And we use census data. So each title in affirmative action plan has a census code assigned to it. And folks, census codes and that availability data that derives from that census information, that is used in just about any kind of government agency that requires research, medical, housing, banking. So census codes and the use of that census data, it's there for a reason, and it was used in affirmative action. And what it allowed me to do, or consultants like me, is to run an affirmative action plan and start getting down to what the focus should have been to begin with. What is the talent in your labor market? And are you overlooking any of that talent? Because the census codes go by officials and managers, the EEO categories. There's 9 categories of talent. And the census code says if you're recruiting for chief financial officers in the St. Louis area, here's the availability by race and gender of that talent set. So that's an availability analysis. And folks, that is talent. And it's a different snapshot. If I say, no, I'm going to recruit across the US, that availability number is going to be different. If I'm in a very small rural town, it's going to represent those numbers.
Yeah.
Okay, so the confusion came in when the next step, the goal, right? So we look at our internal utilization. Let's stick with that executive rank, executive level.
Yeah.
And let's say we've got 10% minority, 15% female. And the availability shows there's an availability of 25% minority and 35% availability of raw talent in the labor market. If your current utilization is below that estimate of availability, the systems would throw, and they still do, they throw a flag saying you're the term is underutilized. It shows in St. Louis, we have this availability of chief executives, but we're only utilizing this much. But guess what? That is not necessarily a problem. And this is an area I've always differed.
Okay.
I've never communicated the reports as you have a goal, because here's what happens. out of 15 job groups, you might only have goals identified in 3 areas. When you have a meeting with your management and talent acquisition teams and you call out, we're only below the mark in these 3 areas. Guess what? Folks only focus on those 3 areas.
3 areas.
They kick that off the table right away. And the rest of the year, nobody's paying attention to the availability numbers.
Huh.
And the availability numbers were simply meant to be a benchmark.
Right.
This is where, and the other thing is, we may have had applicant flow from all diverse communities. So the applicant flow might show that we're pulling talent in.
Yeah.
But by the same token, even though the hire didn't shift the availability for females or minorities, we can still show the most qualified individual got the job. And the same applies. At the end of the day, that's what an auditor does. They take those areas where we showed the report showed you had a goal and we had hiring opportunity and we didn't meet the goal. So this is the same kind of audit if they go back to auditing, because as you indicated, now it sounds like they're trying to change it. Now they're and they're talking about reopening some of the audits that have already been closed, holding the white male standard. What were the goals for white males? And have we gone back to the records to make sure that, and using this administration's terminology, not mine, illegal DEI efforts. You're absolutely right. They're flipping that. And they're going to say, okay, we did it this way for a while. Let's open this up. So for the first time, and I'm applauding my software vendor, because when all of this started going wonky at the first of the year, I called them and said, please tell me you're going to add the white and the male category to these affirmative action reports. Because, Julia, that's one of the other things. You had to have meetings about this information, but sometimes 50% of the population didn't see themselves even categorized in a column.
Even represented.
That's a problem. And I always say, if you cannot see yourself represented in the data that's being discussed, that is a problem that is going to cause confusion and, quite frankly, skepticism on down the road.
Yeah. It's almost like it erodes trust because it feels dishonest. Like if you're not even going to, like, we need to see what is.
Exactly.
And that includes even the majority. And so it's almost like there was a pendulum swing so far, but as pendulums do, they go to the other extreme.
I'm going to say I'm going to nod my head off. I'm going to look like a bobblehead. I agree.
And it doesn't solve the problem, because then we just create distrust on the other end. And what we're aiming for really is, like you said, at the end of the day, we want the best talent to be chosen. And we're not going to discriminate against anyone. Is that what I'm hearing you say?
Right. And the other thing, though, getting back to, okay, so, that's the big trying to, keep it palatable for anyone listening. But keep in mind, there are games people play too, though.
Sure.
So like I said, if we deliberately make it, and one of the things in applicant tracking, and this became crucial years ago, was to add a disposition code to every applicant you reviewed. So if you and I were being interviewed for a compliance role, I'll stick with that.
Yeah.
A disposition code would be added to both of our records. So how much background have you had in compliance?
Not a lot.
Okay. So I just ask that question, being fair. I would probably come through as move along for an interview. you would probably come through as they would want to put, uh, you know, better qualified applicant. That's the code
Mm-hmm.
we tell people don't use because it didn't say anything about Julia.
Mm,
What would a code for Julia be if she didn't get moved along in the interview? It would be lack specific skills,
right.
right?
Right.
So an audit is going to go back and make sure that when they applied that code to you, that it was a true
Mm,
resemblance, that other people would come behind the person making that decision, lay our two applications down, and I call it forensic accounting. Are you
interesting.
going back and looking at the decisions that were made? And if wrong decisions were made, by golly, let's learn from those before we're in a compliance review. Because again, generally, any violation is a violation that we accepted of our own policy.
Right. As I hear you just talk about this, I just continue to come back to the idea that this whole area, affirmative action, equal employment opportunity, and now DEI, they're all asking us to be honest and to have integrity. Those are, I'm in
Right.
the world of trying to help our world become more healthy at the human level. And I think one of the challenges is that when we start to put programs in to deal with internal growth and transformation, you're right. It turns into how can I play the game, or um, how can I make this work for me? Because so often there's a sense of fear or unknown that always puts up our defense. I mean, that's what we've learned from all of the neuroscience and
Right.
neurobiology. It just comes up that way. And so I'm so curious, in all of your experience, how have you helped leaders to kind of put down their defense, to be able to meet them where they are and address kind of that natural reflex of, I don't know, I mean, even the word compliance,
I know.
right? It's like,
Look,
oh, I don't
back in the
know.
day, back in the day when I first started this, and you'll know it's back in the day because I wouldn't use it now because nobody would understand the reference, especially when it was less of a diverse group than, I would hope for. I used to open meetings after they did the introduction. I would go, folks, I stand before you like Rodney Dangerfield. It's hard to get respect talking affirmative action, but if you lend me your ears for even 20 minutes, I think you'll have a whole different viewpoint on why we're having this conversation. So, back to to answer your question, what do I do to kind of take down what in their view is ickiness? I don't want to have this
Yeah.
conversation. I find them doing something right. And so, case in point, new client, had the first meeting with them. And I was telling them my approach, meet you in the middle, find out what's going on. Um, and so we had a great conversation. And I asked about any training programs. Um, I just I felt like I was pulling teeth trying to find out, what do you feel like you're doing well in this area? Crickets. So that night, I go home, plop down on the couch watching the evening news, and guess what? The HR manager from that company is being interviewed by Tom Brokaw in the plant that I was just speaking about. And he was being interviewed because of that company's uh, apprenticeship programs that were targeted for veterans. And not only was it an apprenticeship that they supported, it's an apprenticeship that they collaborated with other major companies in the area. And it is government recognized as one of the best apprenticeship programs So obviously, that next morning, I could tell that man was an early bird. I think I called him at 6 a.m. his time. And of course, he answered his phone, and I said, Mr. Manager,
Yeah.
what in the world would keep you from mentioning that apprenticeship program as I was trying to, pull out of somebody a recognition of what matters in compliance? And he said, well, we don't view this as compliance. We view this as good business. And
Mm.
look, I looked at him and I said, well, thank you for proving affirmative action can be good business. And I want to put in a speaking proposal at the next national conference to have you talk about your national apprenticeship program. He went on 5 different speaking engagements around the country sharing that program. And you give a company a little bit of credit, and then all of a sudden they come back and they're like, well, this ties in too, and this ties in. And look, so again, I think every company has something that they're doing very well,
Yeah.
something that their companies, that all walks of life of their employees would say, we value this, whatever it is, whatever that is, the training programs, or back in my day, tuition reimbursement.
Mm.
Get where I'm
Yeah.
going? There's something. I might not like
Something.
every darn thing, but try to find, and that's what I would tell my other colleagues in the space.
Yeah.
I don't ever go on a training junket, a national conference, PR kind of gig, and just talk about me and how I do it. I spotlight a client
Mm.
and what they're doing very well. And I think that shows both the way I operate with my clients to
Mm.
give them room to really bring me in so I can help them distinguish
Yeah.
what really matters and what
What
you should
matters?
lift up and replicate through your other organizations.
Yeah, I imagine that that gained so much trust in his mind with you because you're it's like, I think so many of us assume that someone's coming in, especially an auditor, to find what's wrong. And
Exactly.
it's like we don't want to say anything because there's probably something wrong with that, right?
Right. You
But
tapped it.
but that proved that you really were looking for things that were good. Like, we want to build on these. And then I just got goosebumps when you said that his answer was, well, we don't see that as compliance. We just see it as good business.
Right.
And that's, to me, that's the perfect picture of what you're helping other organizations to do, is find ways that they can just do good business. And I imagine that that program has benefited their company profoundly.
Well, and again, I've had the great fortune of being able to continue to work with that company. And one of
Mm.
the things that they did, and they've gone through a couple of changes, mergers, acquisitions,
Sure.
things like that, needs timing, different age of
Mhm.
their workforce. They took that apprenticeship program and married it with what they call their, I don't want to give the company name, but XYZ University.
Yeah.
So it was their internal training university program. They embedded the apprenticeship program as a component of that, and it's no longer limited to veterans. It's open to
Okay.
anybody, male, female, individuals with disabilities, anybody that can go through and complete that apprenticeship program has a toehold into the very highly skilled craft worker positions.
Wow. And isn't that, I mean, talk about a success story, right? Like, it's not, so now affirmative action, equal employee opportunity isn't just a program, it's becoming embedded in who they are
Exactly.
as a company. And that's
Exactly.
what you're wanting to help really companies shape their culture so that we're not checking boxes.
Exactly.
This isn't
Because
the
when you're
goal.
checking boxes, back to the very beginning when I said the misnomers with goals,
Yeah.
because those goal reports used to print if you were underrepresented in females or minorities, the
Mm.
inquiring minds could say, well, tell me how many people I need. And the report would show you're 1 minority short, 2 female short.
Mm.
So when you're just checking boxes,
Yeah.
back to how we open this, those managers would go look for the 1 minority, the 2 females early on, kick that off their plate, and for the rest of the year, there wouldn't be any focus because they viewed it as a box checking.
Yeah, we checked our boxes. So, Teresa, as we get ready to kind of move this conversation to the end, although I feel like we could go for another however long, but you mentioned and alluded to the idea that now our current struggles with DEI have kind of carried with them some of the misnomers and baggage from affirmative action. I'm just curious, what would you suggest, or what are you advocating for now in the clients that you're working with? How do you help people who feel very resistant to anything DEI to understand better what the goal is, what the purpose of this is, and how to even maybe cultivate some curiosity into how can we as a company do this?
Well, I'll take this real briefly from, again, I started way back when, and diversity was just really being talked about. We had the book, Workforce 2000, all of the different dynamics that we really are seeing today in the racial, and gender composition of our population at large, not just the
Sure.
workforce, has been changing. I'll never forget the day that I walked into my mentor, my boss at Ralston Purina Company, and I sat down and I looked at her and said, "What is the difference between DEI and affirmative action?" And she looked at me and she said, "DEI is more palatable for white people to wrap their heads around." That's exactly, now keep in mind, this was the mid 90s.
Sure.
I viewed it early on because we would talk about this a lot. And I told her, I said, well, no, I think it makes perfect sense, because if you think about it, if affirmative action brings together people that have never really worked and played in the same sandbox for very long, we are going to need training programs that teach people to be inclusive.
Yeah.
To understand what diversity really means. What's the benefits of diversity? So fast forward, when I talk about some of the same mistakes, the mistakes were diversity started talking goals too, or not talking goals specifically, but making statements like, when we hire at XYZ company at this level, diversity to us means we're going to increase this representation. Right?
Yeah.
Back to the cases. DEI folks are saying nobody gets sued under DEI. Well, you do if you break the civil rights regulations and the EEO regulations. So back to companies under affirmative action or DEI. One case was a company got sued and it was their DEI program. White males won because they were doing RIFs, not because of performance or anything. They just had to, business climate required that they lay off 4 people. So the company operated on first in, first out, or last in, first out, right?
Yeah.
Seniority. So they had to let go of 4 people. The 4 people that were going to be let go were the 4 people that they finally were able to hire that impacted their diversity goals. So in that case, they decided, no, we're going to keep those 4 people. We'll go the next 4 people below and terminate them. And lo and behold, a diversity program got in trouble for viewing goals in a way they should have never been viewed as goals. And again, you violated your own company policy. So it's some of the same. And like I said, the folks that didn't like affirmative action are probably never going to like diversity. But my thing is, now that the two have come together in, quite frankly, such a negative way, I hope that we get together as DEI people and compliance people and share the data and talk about why the data can be very, very valuable, and the data works for everyone.
Yeah.
But I've been a full proponent forever. The discussion of goals, and we hit a goal or we didn't hit a goal, that was never the intent. It's
Yeah.
the availability of talent. Where does the talent lie? And do we have policies that are preventing us from tapping into this group that
Mm.
shows to be one of our predominant groups in our area?
Wow.
So,
It's a complicated topic, partly because, excuse me, because it taps into the emotions of
oh,
people,
yeah,
right? I mean, it taps into those deeper spaces. And that just, I mean, it challenges then all of us to stay in our thinking brain instead of defaulting into our reaction brain.
exactly.
And I see you really trying to help people, be able to come back to, let's just look at this. I'm for you. I'm with you. You're not alone here. We're not out to get anyone. Let's um, kind of get set here and let's learn and grow together. And, at the end of the day, don't we all want a world where we can get along and where we can operate with the integrity of, yeah, the best person,
Right,
individual, uh we're going to bring in, and that there's kind of that becomes the norm, that it's
right.
trusted.
And again, and this kind of closed it up very nicely on what we were talking about. And this is a mistake that both programs have made. Instead of me, let's say you're my new hire
Mm.
and I'm introducing you to my clients for the first time, instead of saying, oh, here's Julia, my affirmative action hire. So they do that with D&I too. Here,
Really?
here's XYZ, our new DEI hire. How about, folks? Here's Julia, the newest rockin' member of our compliance team. So the
Yeah.
labels, overuse of the labels that tag someone through their whole career. Craziness. So
Yeah.
stop it, folks that are listening.
Stop it, man. Well, we're going to have to do this again because I feel like there's a lot that we didn't even get close to. But I just want to say thank you for coming and sharing your expertise and just giving us an insight into, how affirmative action and DEI are related and where we are today. And just really appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity. And like I said, I'm glad you talked me down and calmed me down a little bit because I really enjoyed it.
Awesome. All right. Well,
Yep.
thanks everyone. Thanks for joining us, and we will see you next time.
Thank you so much.